Good evening, my friends. It is truly an honor to spend this time with you today. Whenever I stand in front of a room like this, or speak to people who care deeply about their health, I feel a profound sense of responsibility. Because the truth is, what we talk about tonight may literally change the trajectory of someone's life. My name is Dr. Antonio Miles. I've spent more than 4 decades practicing medicine, specializing in metabolic health, cardiovascular disease, and the biological mechanisms that drive aging. Over those years, I've treated thousands of patients, performed countless clinical consultations, and collaborated with researchers across the world studying how our everyday habits shape the long-term health of our brains, our hearts, and our blood vessels. But tonight, I want to begin with a story. About 6 years ago, a patient named Margaret came into my clinic. Margaret was 72 years old, bright, sharp-minded, full of humor. She had been a school teacher for almost 40 years. She had raised 3 children, volunteered at her church, walked her dog every morning. In every sense of the word, she was doing what most people would call everything right. She didn't smoke. She rarely drank alcohol. She walked regularly. Her cholesterol numbers looked acceptable. Her blood pressure was slightly elevated, but nothing alarming. And Margaret was proud of one thing above all else, her diet. When she sat across from me, she smiled and said something I have heard thousands of times. Doctor, I eat vegetables every single day. Now, let me pause here and ask all of you something. How many of you in this room believe that vegetables are always good for you? You can raise your hands. Almost every hand goes up. And that makes sense, because from childhood we've been told that vegetables are universally healthy. Doctors say it. Nutritionists say it. Public health campaigns repeat it endlessly. Eat more vegetables. Protect your heart. Protect your brain. And in many cases, that advice is absolutely correct. But here's the part that very few people ever hear. Not all vegetables behave the same way inside the body, especially inside the aging body. Margaret told me she ate vegetables at every meal. Breakfast smoothies full of greens, lunch salads, dinner plates loaded with what she believed were the healthiest plant foods available. She was proud of it. Her family was proud of it. Her previous doctor was proud of it. But Margaret wasn't in my office because everything was going well. 3 weeks earlier, she had suffered what we call a transient ischemic attack, a mini stroke, a warning shot from the brain. Her speech had briefly slurred. Her right hand had gone numb. For 10 terrifying minutes, she thought she might be dying. Thankfully, the symptoms reversed. But medically speaking, a transient ischemic attack is one of the loudest alarm bells the human body can ring. It means the brain has already experienced a dangerous interruption in blood flow. So naturally, I began reviewing her risk factors: blood pressure, cholesterol, inflammation markers, blood sugar control. Everything was moderately elevated, but not dramatically so. Then I began asking about her daily diet, and when she described the vegetables she ate every single day, the quantities, the preparation methods, the combinations, something clicked immediately. Because there are certain vegetables that, under specific biological conditions common in older adults, can contribute to a chain reaction inside the body that increases stroke risk. Now let me say something clearly before we go any further. Vegetables are not the enemy, but biology is more complicated than slogans. The aging human body processes nutrients differently. Hormones shift, gut. Bacteria change. Enzyme activity alters. Blood vessels lose flexibility. And certain plant compounds that are harmless, even beneficial, in younger individuals can create very different effects in people over 60. Margaret had unknowingly built her daily diet around several of the worst offenders. Once we adjusted her nutrition and addressed the metabolic mechanisms behind the problem, something remarkable happened. Her blood pressure dropped within weeks. Her inflammatory markers improved. Her blood sugar stabilized. And most importantly, the vascular stress signals that increase stroke risk began to reverse. Margaret is now 78 years old. No strokes, no neurological damage, still walking her dog every morning. Now, why am I telling you this story? Because tonight we are going to talk about something that almost no one in mainstream medicine explains properly. We are going to talk about 7 vegetables that, under the wrong conditions, may quietly increase stroke risk in older adults, not because vegetables are inherently harmful, but because the interaction between plant compounds, aging blood vessels, and metabolic health is far more complex than most dietary advice suggests. And once you understand the biology behind this, you will never look at your plate the same way again. Now I want to transition into something very important. Let's talk about the problem itself. Stroke is one of the most misunderstood conditions in modern medicine. When most people think about stroke, they imagine something sudden and unpredictable, a bolt from the blue. One moment you're fine, the next moment everything changes. But medically speaking, strokes are rarely sudden. They are the final event in a long biological story that has been unfolding silently for years. To understand this, I want you to imagine your circulatory system as the plumbing network of a massive sea. Your heart is the central pumping station. Your arteries are the large pipelines carrying oxygen-rich blood to neighborhoods all across the body. Your smaller vessels, the arterioles and capillaries, are the narrow residential streets delivering nutrients to every cell. And your brain? Your brain is the most demanding district in the entire city. Although it represents only about 2% of your body weight, your brain consumes roughly 20% of your oxygen supply. That means its plumbing system must remain exceptionally clear, flexible, and efficient. Now imagine what happens if that plumbing system slowly begins to narrow, not overnight, gradually. Tiny deposits begin forming along the inner walls of the pipes. Inflammation causes microscopic swelling. Oxidative stress damages the delicate lining of the blood vessels, what we call the endothelium. The pipes stiffen. The flow becomes turbulent. Now add one more factor. Blood itself can become thicker and more prone to clotting under certain dietary conditions. So now we have a city plumbing system where the pipes are narrowing, the walls are irritated, and the fluid moving through them is becoming stickier. Do you see where this is going? Eventually, somewhere along that network, a clot forms, or a narrowed artery becomes completely blocked. When that happens in the brain, oxygen delivery stops, and brain cells are extraordinarily sensitive to oxygen deprivation. Within minutes, neurons begin to die. That is what we call a stroke. Now here is the critical part that most people never hear. Certain plant compounds, particularly those found in some common vegetables, can influence several steps in this entire cascade. They can affect blood clotting chemistry. They can interact with gut bacteria in ways that produce compounds like TMAO, which has been strongly associated with cardiovascular risk. E can affect mineral balance, particularly potassium and oxalates, which influence vascular stiffness. They can alter nitric oxide signaling, which controls how blood vessels dilate and relax. And here's where age becomes the key factor. When you are 30 years old, your metabolic systems are flexible. Your kidneys filter efficiently, your gut microbiome is diverse. Your arteries are elastic. Your liver detoxifies compounds quickly. But by the time someone reaches 65 or 70, several of those systems have changed dramatically. Kidney filtration declines. Gut bacteria shift towards species that produce more inflammatory metabolites. Arteries become less elastic. Enzyme activity slows. And suddenly, foods that once posed no issue begin interacting with the body in new ways. Let me pause for a moment because this is critical. The goal is not to eliminate vegetables. The goal is to understand which vegetables and which preparation methods can quietly stress aging vascular systems. Because the difference between a protective diet and a harmful one can sometimes come down to very small biochemical details. Now let's move into something that most doctors never explain properly. The science of what actually happens inside your body after you eat certain vegetables. I want you to picture a single bite of food entering your mouth. It seems simple, but from a physiological perspective, it triggers an incredibly complex chain reaction. Digestion begins immediately. Saliva releases enzymes that start breaking down carbohydrates. The stomach releases acid and digestive proteins. Then the partially digested food moves into the small intestine, where nutrients begin entering the bloodstream. But here's the fascinating part. Many plant compounds don't get absorbed immediately. Instead, they travel deeper into the digestive system, reaching trillions of bacteria living in your colon, your gut microbiome. And these bacteria behave almost like a chemical factory. They metabolize plant compounds and convert them into new molecules that enter circulation. Sometimes those molecules are beneficial. Short-chain fatty acids, for example, support metabolic health. But sometimes the bacterial transformation produces compounds that stress the cardiovascular system. One of the most important of these compounds is called trimethylamine N-oxide, or TMAO. This molecule has been strongly associated with increased risk of stroke, heart attack, and vascular inflammation. And certain vegetables contain compounds that gut bacteria can convert into TMAO precursors. Now, this doesn't happen equally in everyone. It depends on the composition of your gut microbiome. And here is something fascinating we have discovered in the last decade. As people age, the microbiome often shifts toward bacterial species that produce higher levels of TMAO from dietary compounds. In other words, the exact same vegetable may produce completely different metabolic outcomes in a 40-year-old versus a 75-year-old. That difference is one of the central themes of tonight's discussion. Now I want to pause and ask you something. How many of you have ever been told by your doctor that the same healthy food can behave differently in the body as you age? Very few people hear that explanation, but it is absolutely fundamental to understanding cardiovascular health later in life. Now, in a moment, we're going to talk about the specific vegetables that appear again and again in stroke risk research when consumed excessively in older adults. And I promise you, some of the foods on this list will surprise you, because several of them are widely marketed as superfoods. But before we reveal those, we need to understand one more critical biological event, the turning point inside the bloodstream where vascular stress suddenly accelerates. Because once you see this process clearly, you will understand why small dietary adjustments can produce enormous health benefits. And when we return to Margaret's story later tonight, you'll see exactly how this knowledge helped her reverse a dangerous trajectory that could have ended very differently.